3/4 from Heaven, Chapter 15, A Chance to Exit. Joe looked at me stunned, his arm shaking, his jaw hanging open. I could see his teeth, which were now yellow and sharp. I knew mine had to be the same. I was shaking too. I raised the gun to eye level to marvel at it. This was not an ordinary weapon. This was a tool to hunt, a tool to kill. "You killed Georges," Joe moaned. I looked up at him from my daze and quickly pocketed the tool. I took 2 stones and threw them into a pile. I retrieved the third from my own pocket. I locked gazes with Joe for a minute, who hadn't even moved yet. "Joe, we're leaving," I said calmly, but inside I was a wreck. Joe just stood there like an idiot, shaking like a leaf. "We worked so hard to get here, all for nothing. Your hands are badly burned and I'm turning into one of them. For God's sake, look at your wife. All for nothing," Joe screamed. "Joe, please, you want to leave." "I need to leave," I began, pulling out George's gun again, although I didn't know why. "Let's go." I threw the last stone into the pile with the rest, and the portal bloomed into life. "It won't stay open for long, so let's go." I felt the portal sucking at me, but didn't move from my spot. I pulled Amy close, who was now stirring in her sleep. "I do want to leave, but this is all happening so fast. Give me a second," Joe said, crouching to his knees. He gagged and vomited into the dirt. "Joe, please," I yelled, pointing the gun at his head. Joe then looked up at me, and I'll never forget what I saw in his eyes. I saw death. His eyes were yellow and had slit pupils like the shadow people. Tears streamed down from them. Human tears. They were bigger and brighter, but still Joe's. I could sense him behind those eyes, but the shadow mask was hiding it. He burst into tears as I lowered my weapon. I was just about to run to him when Georges appeared behind Joe, blood engulfing his face, shadow eyes burning with anger. His purple lips curled into a grimace, revealing sharp, shark-like teeth. He had a long steak knife in his hand he pulled from his belt. I screamed out, and even raised my gun. I shot blindly into the air, but only hit the sky. I was too late. Georges pounced on Joe's back and without hesitation slit across Joe's neck. Joe screamed, but only got out a deaf squeak. Blood splurted from his throat like a river, painting the air platform. His eyes were his own now, blue and normal-sized. They were full of pain and death, but were strong. Joe was telling me he was going to die, right? Not as a monster, but as a friend. I shot again, but only at air. I reloaded, but was cut short. A land sky came into view overhead, and 5 long steel cords unveiled from above. "You've lost, Jim. You've become the enemy," Georges screeched with glee, tossing Joe to the ground. "You did this to yourself. Now give me the gun." 20 officers were now sliding down from the aircraft, clad with weapons. I looked up to my doom, then to Georges, to Joe, who was now reaching into his pocket, gasping for air. Then the twirling vortex behind me. I was about to yank Amy by the arm and jump to the portal, but if I didn't grab the stones, I'd be whisked back to the shadow world in an hour's time, probably to arrows pointed at my head. I wasn't going to give up without a fight. I cocked my gun and shot up into the air, picking off 2 from the ladders. Arrows were now being shot down at me, and one nicked my arm, but didn't stay in my shoulder. I yelled in pain and shot the archer in his eye. He fell to his death. I got 2 more before they reached the platform and pounced on me. I shot one in the shin and sent him off the cliff. Another arrow embedded itself in my thigh, and I collapsed to my knees. I shot 5 times and only injured 2 in the process. An arrow passed by my head and tore a good piece of my right ear off. I aimed and fired, cracking one soldier's rib cage to splinters. That's about when Georges rear-ended me and slammed me to the ground. He sliced across my back, and I elbowed him right in the mouth, knocking out many of his front teeth. He fell off of me, but a soldier got down face to face, and I ended up uppercutting him in the jaw. He shot his arrow dumbly into the air. I turned to face Georges, who was spitting out his blood. I screamed in protest as I realized what he was doing. He had Amy pulled up to his chest, the knife resting just below her chin. She was awake now and was wide-eyed, her gaze directed at me. "Amy!" I yelled. Georges laughed, and I raised the gun at George's head. A gun shot went off, but not mine. Georges was struck in between his armpit and rib cage. That part of his chest ripped off in a bloody mass as his screams of anguish echoed across the valley. Amy fled into my arms as an arrow struck me in my forearm. Joe was clutching his own hunting revolver he'd used when we sometimes went to the firing range. He smiled at me, his eyes certainly his own. They rolled backwards and he fell sideways in his last breath. Georges hit the platform hard, writhing in his own blood. I gathered Amy in my arms. The soldiers weren't focused on me anymore. They were crowding around the closing portal and helping a yelping Georges to his feet. I found my time to escape and fled into the woods south of the platform. I didn't stop running. Not even to rest, not even to look back. I just kept running, Amy bouncing in my arms, 3 arrows protruding from my body. I didn't stop. As I ran, the landscape around me blurred, and Amy stared restlessly at her stump of a hand. I ran and ran until I came upon the bank of the Derringer Lake, where a small ship was making its way across the currents. 2 soldiers were huddled over Georges, who was sprawled out on the deck. Even from where I was, I could hear his screams of pain and anger. They were on their way to the palace with Georges and the stones, and I had to stop them. Chapter 16. The Race. I fell to my hands and knees and wept. I wept for Amy, Georges, and Joe. All were being hurt or killed by this new world. Georges was dying, but this still wasn't over. It should have been, after all I'd gone through, but it wasn't. I wanted desperately to get home, but not if the Shadow King got there first. And if he did, I'd have to stay in his new world, where Georges would rule and hunt me for game. Amy came up from behind me and kissed me on my gray, blood-stained chin. I kissed her back, and we fell to the ground in warm embrace. I helped Amy up onto the cliff, some 20 feet above the Derringer. We couldn't take the lake, so we'd have to go around, which was very rocky and treacherous. I told Amy everything that had happened to me over the week as we hiked on, but I cut it pretty short. I clung on to a vine hanging from a rocky ledge and edged my way upwards, Amy hanging onto my shoulders. I stepped on to a patch of pebbles and slipped backwards, scraping my upper body. I tore open my new jeans and tore off the skin on my arm. The arrow head I couldn't fish out of my thigh wedged into my muscle even more. I gritted my teeth and continued onwards. About 10 minutes later, the same land sky as before hovered over our heads. I got down into a sharp thicket with Amy as it passed by. I pulled myself out with a few scratches, and we followed a path down the cliffside, which would meet up with the back of the kingdom. There on the path, 4 soldiers were winding upwards with bows, arrows, and wooden spears. I once again found us a hiding spot. We took the way around the path, which was through thick foliage of orange plants and towering canopies. I must have stepped somewhere wrong, because a huge army of feather-winged beasts burst from the trees from our left and right. "Run!" I yelled to Amy. That was later answered by a barrage of arrows and flying spears. There were more of them now. I whipped out my gun and quickly cocked it. Amy watched me in awe as I shot squarely at a soldier, decapitating him instantly. They were now coming in from every angle, and I only had a few more bullets left. I hauled her up quickly and gathered the spear for ammo. Amy trailed along behind me, blood curling down the curves of her nose. She only screamed once, though. A soldier fell from my left, and I stabbed weakly out at him. He was only scathed, but I managed to ease away from his flying arrows. Another sprang out of the bushes to Amy's right and flung a spear at my feet. I leapt over it and stabbed him in the neck. I left the spear, but helped myself to a bow and 2 arrows. Letting Amy stumble ahead, I turned and figured out its mechanics. I pulled and released an arrow from the bow and was able to strike one soldier in the chest. He flinched comically in one spot before collapsing into another attacking soldier. I gasped as 5 land skies burst from the overhanging clouds where soldiers were dropping like meteors. I released my last arrow, but I was only able to hit a tree trunk. I turned and sprinted through the plants with Amy as the jungle behind us was trampled down by thousands of guards. Arrows rained from the sky and spears from all sides. I was scathed by some, and others struck into my lower back or arms. I would only tear them out from my own flesh and string them onto my bow. I shot a glance behind me to see a herd of thousands of soldiers, leaping and sprinting at us with great agility. Some would jump high into the air until their heads grazed the branches above. I wasn't watching where I was scurrying, so I smashed my shin into a high-hanging root, and I flipped perfectly off the ground and onto the path into a large muddy ditch. I slid down it, smashing it to small boulders and launching off of dead tree stumps. The ditch soon broke off and fell at a 90-degree angle, down into a deep puddle of disregarded rainwater and mud. I grasped onto anything I could find around me, roots, boulders, trees, but my muddy hands only slid off. Then there was nothing to stop me, so I dragged my heels and dug my palms into the deep mud. It slowed me down a bit, but didn't stop me from my fall. I fell legs first off the cliff. I closed my eyes and pulled my knees to my chest as I fell for what seemed like 10 minutes. Then, like a smash from thousands of rocks the size of human fists, I hit the water. My legs hit the shallow bottom, and I felt them buckle into the soft soil below. Right when my cheeks felt the icy hot sting of the water, I fell unconscious. I woke up with my face down in the water. I lifted myself out of the dirt and coughed out what I had inhaled. I grabbed onto the mud and painfully pulled myself out. I got to my feet and realized my shoes were still in the puddle. I leaned up against the tree and wiped the sludge off of my eyes. It hadn't been a deep puddle, but when I hit it I must have been stunned for only a few seconds. My clothes were weighing me down, so I tore off my socks and shirt. Above me, I heard the cries of the shadow men and the firing of arrows. But what happened to Amy? No one had noticed where I had gone, but had they gotten Amy? An arrow landed in the puddle with a small plop. I looked up, alarmed, brushing away my dirt-encrusted hair. I heard cries and the sloshing of mud. More than one of the guards had seen me fall and were coming after me. I started to run, but my shins and ankles were bruised and sprained. I moaned and decided to limp away. As I made my way into another forest hangover, I heard screams and the splash of the puddles. I snuck a peek over my shoulder as one of the Darmy men was pulling himself out of the lapping water. He pulled a spear from his belt and snarled a warning at me. I got the gun out and decided to waste one of my bullets. I found him on the ground, but knew he was going to leap upward, so I shot in the air. Sure enough, the stupid creature jumped right into the bullet, tearing off his forehead. I gathered his spear, turning to wait for the rest. They all jumped at me, but I was able to stab two of them. One stabbed me in my already blood-soaked shoulder. I screamed and flung the spear in one arc. I was bathed in a spray of blood. It fell on me like a bag of compost. More were coming, and I heaved desperately at the dead weight. When I finally did, 8 more soldiers were easing their way out of the mud, all snarling, either spears or bows and arrows on their belts. I threw the spear weakly, and it only turned over in the air and plopped in the mud. They jumped at me as I sprinted away, despite the agonizing pain. I fled as arrows and spears were hot on my trail. I needed to get to the palace before Georges did. I needed to stop his horrible plan. I needed to save the world. Ahead of me was only a huge wall of brick, the surrounding wall of Law's door. I had made it. I hit the wall and climbed it ferociously. When a spear struck at my scalp and fell away, I kept climbing. When my fingernails tore out of my fingertips, I grasped for the top of the wall. Colors spilled across my eyes, and I was changing there on the top of the wall. There I was completing my fall into insanity. I screamed and laughed at the same time, as my skin transitioned to a shade of gray. I whooped with glee and cried out in pain as my tongue extended and slid out between my gums. I leaned over the wall right as my eyes tinted yellow. I fell, but my sight came back to me like a light switching on in a dark alleyway. I landed neatly on my feet in the Law's door courtyard. I looked at my hands, which were now shadow hands. My nails were long, sharp, and black. I ran my serpent tongue over my teeth and found them sharp. I ran my hand through my hair, and clumps of it fell away in my fingers. Out of the courtyard doors came a running shadow man. I leapt up without even thinking and clocked him across his head with my fist. He fell on his face, and I bit into his arm. I tore a piece of flesh off the bone and swallowed it dryly. I put the gun in my waistband and strode into the open courtyard doors. I walked inside forgetting Amy or Joe. Inside I would meet either failure with death or victory with death. There was no way of cheating my demise at this point. Chapter 17. Betrayal. It was like stepping into a minefield, triggered by the first step, a minefield of arrows and spears. The great hall of Law's door was swarmed with armed shadow men, all aiming right at my temple. I stopped right where I was, letting the doors behind me swing closed. Georges stepped into view, pushing many of the soldiers out of his way. He was frowning sadly and was holding the bullet wound Joe had given him. He was also holding Joe's firing pistol. It wasn't aimed at me, but was hanging at his side, cocked. "Jim, oh Jim, what on earth do you plan to do?" Georges said, down his nose to me. "I would just give up now, before more arrows are added to your collection there." There was a few snickers around him. I was about to raise my own weapon when Georges rose his. His serpent tongue was rolling out of his grin. His eyes were now electric and alive. "Jim, if you want to keep your head, I would think twice," Georges said. "If you want to keep Amy, I'd also think twice." Amy was thrust through the crowd, a ball gag in her mouth, and a sturdy rope around her wrists. She was sobbing and yelling muffled words under her gag. I kept my hands at my sides as Georges nodded his head. His gun didn't falter, though. He jerked his head in my direction as a guard behind me snatched my free hands and tied them together. Georges told the guard I could keep my weapon and the ball gag out of my mouth. "The weapon is for when you're rotting away in the dungeon, so you can have sweet relief," Georges mocked as Amy and I were led through the crowd and up a spiraling staircase of maybe 10 floors. I gave Amy a loving glance, and she returned it. It was too late. The stones were now in the king's hands, and Amy and I were now vulnerable to just about anything. Georges opened the double doors at the top of the stairs. Inside, the soldiers pushed into a room covered from floor to ceiling with fine art and statues. This was much different than the room we met the king in a few weeks ago. This was much bigger and nicer, most likely his throne room. Sure enough, the throne sat before us, sat atop a large platform. The king sat in it, looking a lot older than I remembered him. His jeweled crown twinkled in the candlelight around us. He was wrapped elegantly in a red silk cloak that seemed too big for him. Amy and I were coerced to our knees in front of the platform. The guards and Georges followed suit. "So, my lord, what shall we do with these foes?" George said, which didn't sound at all like him. He got back to his feet and the two guards stepped away. We remained on our knees. "Leave them. They deserve to see their own world be taken away," the king pronounced. "Excellent, my king," Georges cried. "So should we make the trade now? I can see the stones are on your table over there." "No, Mr. Georges, we shan't," the king said. He got down from his throne and passed by the dumbfounded Georges. The king limped over to the bookcase that lined the whole wall. He reached up high and let a dusty, battered book fall into his hand. "Excuse me, my lord?" Georges asked. "Mr. Georges, this novel is called The Bind Between Us, and it is written by a literature professor of the 1800s. He once prophesied that God created Earth twice the size as the one you know today." He pointed at each one of us with his curled nail. "But this Earth contained so many people of too many different races and families. So God decided to split this planet into two different Earths, one you know, and the one we stand in now. But to make sure these planets never converged again, each was hidden from one another's view. The only way to travel from Earth 1, your Earth, to Earth 2, mine, was 3 stones God created just in case the real Earth needed to be joined together. So after a while, God decided he didn't need the stones, so he hid them on your Earth, Mr. Georges. And you, by chance, found them. But this novel was only a hypothesis of sorts. There was no way to prove it, so people thought this author was insane. He didn't stop there, though. He had artists create statues with 2 ends of the real Earth, each connected by a rainbow, as you've probably seen in my courtyard. He tried desperately to get his idea to stick, but it didn't. The king went over to the table with the stones and picked up a medallion with the 2 sides of the Earth and the rainbow engraved on it. One end was plentiful and the other cracked and black. "I collected all his works and his art because I was fascinated. I believed in his story while everyone else didn't. But just like him, I didn't have proof. In his novel, he wrote that if the 3 stones were retrieved, the portal between us would be opened. Only if we destroy 2 of them, the portal would open, connecting our worlds. If 3 were destroyed, the portal would be gone for good, with the stones. So you see, Georges, you gave me my proof. The stones." He held the medallion out in front of Georges. "You have finished my life's work, and the author's dream. I can finally connect the Earth, and I will be able to rule it. I rule this half, why not the other half?" The king chuckled. "No, no, no, my lord, what about our bargain? I'd have this world and you'd have mine," Georges rebuffed. "Oh, come now, Mr. Georges, do you really think I'd believe you were the king of Earth?" "You're kidding," the king replied. "I knew you were going to destroy them once I went through. I'm not an idiot." George's, Amy's, and my jaw dropped. Georges didn't have anything to say. He just stood there, stiff as a board, his hands shaking like leaves. "But my lord, we had a bargain," Georges screeched. His yellow eyes started to gloss over with tears. With a blink of an eye, the king nodded his wrinkled head. One of the guards sprang forward and let a spear roll off his long fingers and jut perfectly into George's gut. Georges screamed and hurried forward, blood seeping out of his mouth. He fell to his knees. The king strode forward and dropped his steel medallion at George's knees. "Destroy the stones," he said calmly before getting back into his throne. The guard who had thrown the spear came over to the table where the stones sat. He reached for a large golden brick and lifted it over his head with both hands. The guard behind us and the king were leaning forward with anticipation. Georges looked up at the table with tearful eyes. He hacked up more blood onto the medallion. I yelped with fright as the brick hit the first stone with a head-blowing crack. There was a shot of bright, blinding light. Then the brick and the stone split into 2 halves. The struck rock now turned from a bright red to a dull gray. Then, without further notice, the portal appeared where the king's bookcase once stood. Only this portal was like a window to my own Earth. It showed me the street corner of George's house, where this had all started. The portal was only the size of a regular-sized skylight, but I could see the whole block in a full view of George's own pale white house. My car was still parked in the driveway. The king laughed excitedly, and Georges moaned in pain, frustration. "A hammer didn't break one of those damn things, but a brick does," I thought bitterly. The other! The king exclaimed. He was now hanging off his throne like a kid. The guard nodded and snatched another golden brick from the table and lifted it over his helmeted head. Georges yelled out in anguish through a spray of blood. He fell over onto his hands and knees, screaming his protest. There was another loud crack of the stone splitting and of the brick shattering under the soldier's hands. There was a bright white light and a bolt of blue electricity surged through the throne room. The window portal now slowly extended its capacity until it took up the whole wall. It didn't even look like there was any kind of break between the worlds. It looked like, truly, the real Earth had returned, whole and strong. The king limped up to the portal and stuck his arm through where the wall had once stood. He snapped his fingers for the other soldier. "Take the 3 to the dungeon and call for army forces 1, 2, and 3, the king announced. "We're going to take this world by storm." Then he turned to the soldier by the table and told him to keep the last stone safe in his armor. The soldier did so. The soldier forced Amy and I to our feet and led us to the doors. Another soldier from out in the hall yanked Georges up by his collar and dragged him after us. As we left, I saw the king dancing up and down in front of the portal. He would step in and out of the 2 worlds as he whooped in gratification. No, we're out of a bargain, Georges screeched as the double door shut in front of us, taking us away from our home once again. Chapter 18. Search for the Stone. We were taken to the exact dungeon Joe and I had been thrown in the last time we were here. I didn't struggle like Amy and Georges. I was too shocked as to what had just taken place. All of this was happening so fast. Suddenly all our fates were sealed, and my world was as well. This all seemed like a bad dream. George's plan, which Joe and I had thought was a horrific idea in the first place, had backfired. Now we were all going to rot, until we all killed ourselves. The trapdoor was wrenched open. The guard holding Amy and I pushed me aside and shoved Amy harshly forward into the open hatch. Amy struck her shins on the way down, and I could hear her stilted screams. I heard a dull plop at the bottom. No, you don't understand. I'm the king of this world. I'm the king. You must obey me. No, Georges screamed as the other soldier struck him across the head with the blunt edge of his spear. Georges made a dry scream before he toppled forward, smashing his shoulders. Then his body slowly tilted to the side and he fell headfirst down the cellar. I could also hear him screeching and clawing at the soil walls around him. Another dull plop and more screams and curses. Now you go, Askel, the soldier holding me snapped. I nodded and crouched down next to the trapdoor. I struck my legs inside the hatch and with one deep breath, scooched myself forward. I struck the soft mud and sank into it, feeling all the bones from my waist down rattle. I keeled over and fell face first into the muck. I maintained consciousness somehow and laid there, face first, where I was, recuperating. Then I heard a pistol cocked behind me. Get up, you frascant, Georges called at me. I said get up. I moaned achingly and got onto my knees. I wiped the mud from my eyes. Georges stood in front of me, caked in fresh mud. The spear in his gut was now gone, revealing his crying wound. Joe's pistol was aimed at my forehead once again. His eyes were now glowing yellow, like the sun, his lips curled up in a scowl. Come on, Georges, I whimpered. Let's just... No, you ruined this for me. If you and Joe hadn't come between me and the king, Georges yelled, it's because of you he was annoyed. He thought I'd do the same. That's how he knew about my plan. Georges, shut up, Georges screeched. I hate you. He shot at me, but missed by only an inch. The mud to the left of me exploded in a shower of dirt. Georges recoiled from the shot and held his wound with his free hand. He moaned in agony. I sprang sorely to my feet and plowed forward at Georges. I took him off the ground and smashed him into the mud. The pistol was brandished at me, but I uppercutted Georges in the chin. My hand reached for my waistband and fumbled for my own gun. Georges helped himself up by the wall next to him and cocked his weapon again. Georges then struck me across my temple with the pistol. Stars exploded in front of my eyes as I fell off of him. He helped himself up by the wall next to him and cocked his weapon again. I fell onto all my rogue arrows, but they only snapped off my back. Georges shot again, and the bullet struck the wall above me. Fragments of the soil wall rained down across my face. Oh! Georges fell against the wall, clutching his guts. Blood ran down his fingers. I dusted off the soil and sat up. As fresh blood trickled down my cheek, I whipped out my gun. I aimed it quickly at Georges. He looked up at me and growled with anger. He raised his own weapon and fired, but he hadn't cocked it. He started running at me, pulling the trigger randomly with no discharge. Georges stumbled and fell on me, but I kneed him brutally in his neck. He gagged and struck the gun forcefully into my side. I howled and tried to push him off me. George's knee was on my hand, which held the gun, so I tried my hardest to shift his weight. Georges grasped me by the neck and forced the back of my head into the dungeon wall behind me. I heard him cock his pistol. His face was inches from mine. It was muddy and gray. His lips were purple and the teeth behind them glowed bright red. His eyes were open to their full extent, evil and not his. All I knew was I couldn't let this horrible beast live any longer. This wasn't my poker buddy. This was a mask. This was an evil costume. I slipped the gun out from under George's knee and put it into alignment with his heart. I heard a loud discharge, and then George's ribcage splitting. Then there was a warm spray of blood on my face. There was a soft gag, and Georges fell backward off of me. The pistol fell from his hand and struck me on my shoulder. Georges was dead. I caught my breath, and that's when I remembered Amy. I scrambled to my feet and limped around the dungeon, edging across the shackles on the walls and the discarded human bones on the ground. Amy, can you hear me? I asked. The dungeon was basically dark besides the light from up above through the dungeon door cracks. So I edged about carefully calling her name until my feet struck something hard. I bent down slowly to inspect it. Felt around, and it was indeed Amy. I pulled her close and into the shred of light. Amy! Amy! No answer. I looked closely at Amy's face. It was twisted. Her eyes were open and rolled back. Her mouth was wide open, a long trickle of blood running down her chin. Amy! Amy! I started to sob. That's when I noticed her head was tilted at a 90-degree angle. I lifted her head up in my hand and then cried out. Her neck was broken, most likely from the fall. I lifted her in my arms and pulled her close. I sobbed bitterly into her bosom, cursing God for taking away my love. I held her like that for maybe 30 minutes, calling her name to the dripping ceiling. Once I placed her back into the soft mud and made the cross symbol on her forehead, my left hand landed upon a diary. I picked it up and examined it. It was a diary owned by some prisoner a long time ago. I flipped through the pages and found them all soggy and empty. There was some odd ballpoint-shaped pen in the binding of it. I rested my back up against the wall and held the small notebook across my bare chest. I looked over at my best friend's corpse lying dormant in the mud. I had killed my best friend, the man I knew since I was young. That's when I set this diary open in front of me and began my tale. All around me sat the dead bodies of people I had once loved, and the world and home I had once loved was now being destroyed above my head. I couldn't do anything about it. So I wrote. The stench was overwhelming and the moisture was freezing my body. I decided to take George's shirt, which was long-sleeved and would keep me warm. I carefully lifted him upwards and felt something inside him crack. I slipped it over his head and winced at the smell and grotesque appearance of his exposed intestines. It had seemed like a few hours since I'd been down there. So far I had gotten halfway through my journal. I curled up next to it and started to write again, but sleep soon found me. I fell into my dreams, and when I woke again, some 10 hours later, the war of the earths would just be getting interesting. I did wake, but I knew it had to be night. The light from the trapdoor above was absent, but my eyes soon adjusted. I went back to my journal, but was distracted by the stench of George's and Amy. I folded my journal into my pants and crawled away from the two, kissing Amy on the lips one last time. The light was just coming back from above, so I decided to return to my journal. That's when hunger struck me. I hadn't eaten anything since breakfast a day ago. The arrowheads were still lodged in my flesh, too, and they were starting to get infected and turning purple. I was cold all the time, so I wrapped my blue hands in a dead body's old tattered shirt. I decided to cleanse myself, so I used the shirt to wipe the mud from all over my body. I finished my journal and fell asleep again. When I woke up, I felt like an icicle, and my stomach was growling with hunger. I couldn't even get up to pee anymore. I had no energy whatsoever. I wanted to throw up a number of times, but I only got stomach acid out. I knew I was desperately sick, but I couldn't manage much longer. I noticed the ceiling was dripping a pretty continuous trickle of rainwater into a puddle to my right. I crawled over to it and drank heartily. Although it was muddy and covered with bacteria, my stomach gladly accepted. I didn't drink all of it, but decided to let the puddle grow more in capacity. The light above me was now getting dimmer, signaling nightfall again. That meant I had been down there for a day. I rubbed my covered hands together to keep warm, but I felt like my blood was chilled. Then I found Joe's pistol next to George's corpse. I brought it back to my wall and held it in my hands. It still had a round in it. I kept remembering what Georges had said about me putting myself out of my own misery as I rotted in this dungeon. Could I take my own life? I started to cry and fell asleep again, the pistol held close to my heart. I woke and decided to drink. The puddle was pretty full, so I took in a lot of the cool, satisfying water, but my stomach still demanded food. I didn't want to pee anymore next to my spots, so I made my way into the darkness. I followed the soggy wall with my hand, but it suddenly dropped off. I paused and stared into the pitch black. I could barely see the wall, and it did indeed have some kind of outgrove built into it, like a hallway in the wall. I started towards it, and I found I was in a long hallway winding forwards. I ventured forth down the hallway, edging along carefully. It seemed to go on for maybe 30 minutes, until my blind hand rested upon a heavy door. I felt a handle in the door jam. I tried to open it, but it was, of course, locked. I drew out my gun and fired 3 bullets into the handle. I saw light ahead of me, which momentarily blinded my vision. I pried a piece of wood out from the doorframe and stumbled out of the dungeon. I fell across a grassy hill outside of Law's door. I squinted upwards and saw the portal wide open before Law's door palace, reaching up to the sky and ending at the ground. The earth was now truly connected. I could see what was left of George's block. It was blotted out by fire, and the sky above was blood red. I heard machine guns firing and the flocks of flaming arrows raining down from the sky. I could see tanks plowing over many of the creatures. It was a very depressing scene. Since I was too weak to walk, I decided to crawl up the grassy knoll to get a better view. Once I did, I could see some small skirmishes occurring in the shadow world as well. A tank shell exploded over my head and struck the electric antenna above me. It exploded in a spray of sparks and collapsed into the lower level of the palace as it fell. Rows and rows of shadow soldiers lined up, orderly, arrows strung in their bows. Then a swarm of American soldiers collided with them, responding with assault rifles and machine guns. There was a spray of blood and body parts, so I looked away. Now I knew what I had to do. I had to find the guard who held the last stone, and I had a hunch if I found the king, I'd find the guard. At George's street corner, there was a circle of bodyguards surrounding someone. The king! Of course the king wasn't going to miss this. I proceeded forward toward my old world. No one noticed me as I passed through the portal. Chapter 19. Last Ray of Hope. It was getting worse before it got better. The shadow creatures were surely showing their upper hand. They had agility and strength no one on my earth could match. They would leap several feet up into the air, and were able to rain their arrows or spears right into the soldiers' shoulders. The circle of bodyguards protecting the king weren't letting anyone get anywhere near him. The circle was even getting more and more protected. I could faintly see the king behind his men, cackling and craning his neck to see the battles. Creatures were on top of the roofs, raining down their fiery surprises. Grenades were showing a large opposition as well, but the shadow men were just too stealthy and quick-witted. All in all, we were losing. I dodged quickly behind a rolled-over truck and waited as a grenade went off. I took off with a painful limp towards the wall of bodyguards. They were situated right under George's house, and I saw one of the guards lead the king right into the open door. The door shut behind them. The king was in too much danger out there, so he was escorted into a safer place. But there were still about 20 men protecting all doors of George's house. How in the world was I going to get in there? That's when I took off the opposite way towards my soldiers. They had created a makeshift bunker, with 3 tanks as a barrier. They were firing their weapons between the gaps. A few had rocket launchers pointed right at 3 other lines of shadow men. As I ran past, these SWAT teams were sprinting into the shadow world, all clad with rocket launchers and tear gas. Behind me I heard 5 large explosions. I dove down behind another burning car. I looked back through the portal and saw Law's door engulfed like a torch. I knew it was no more. I looked to my left where an American soldier was operating an upright machine gun. An arrow struck him in the Adam's apple and he collapsed. The reason we weren't dominating was because our soldiers didn't know where to fire. I ran to the machine gun and changed its position. I aimed it at George's house, where the king was now on the roof with 10 other guards. He just wanted to get a better view, but I didn't want to fire red at him in case the guard with the stone got away. I just wanted to clear the front door. I looked down at the complex weapon in front of me and searched for the trigger. I found it and pulled. I lost control and it shot every which way. Bullet shells were exploding all around me and I fell away from the machine. I looked at George's house, where the entrance had not only been cleared, but blown open. But not by me. A grenade had sent the bodyguards through the whole front wall of the house. The guards above, though, went straight to the source and shot an arrow into the soldier's eye. I saw my opportunity and bolted through the wild fires, through the falling dead bodies, through the smoke, the blood, the rain of arrows, and through the rogue bullets. I took out my pistol and held it at my side. 2 shadow men came from either side of me. Each were holding an assault rifle they had stolen from their kills. So far, they were pretty accurate with them as well. 5 Americans trying to get into the shadow world were shot down from these 2 shadow creatures. Was there anything these things couldn't do? They aimed their weapons at me, but one of their heads cracked and fell off their shoulders from a rifle blast. I shot at the other, but was only able to strike one of his arms. He did fall over, giving me a better advantage. I took it and ran into the black smoke shielding the front door of George's house. I fell inside to see the entire house torn apart. Furniture, rugs, clocks, George's big screen, and George's grand piano were cluttered at the foot of the stairs to block the upper floor. I stepped over the dead bodies and started to climb over the clutter. Outside I heard a large explosion, just outside the door again by a rocket launcher shell. Fire burst in through the house and I was wrenched forward into the stairs above me. I struck my elbow hard, but was able to shake off the pain. I struggled forward up the top of the stairs. There was a shadow man dressed in a tattered work shirt and a tie. He stood beside me, clutching a spear. This was no soldier, but a civilian. They were sending civilians in now. This man had blood dripping down his mouth, and he looked angry. He struck at me. I hit the door and bounced off of it. The creature jumped at me and landed on my shoulders. I crumpled, but pulled the trigger of my weapon. The man screeched and died. I pulled him off of me and looked up. The attic door was pulled open above me, where the king had gone through. I cocked my gun and proceeded up the ladder into the attic. I poked my head through the shattered opening and pulled myself out into the heat. I clutched to the roof gutter with all my strength. The roof shingles burned my fingers, but I was able to free the rest of my body. My bare feet had rubbed against the glass shards from the broken window, so when I stood up I winced. "What the?" one of the shadow men cried. An arrow zipped past where my right ear had been. I fell to my stomach and shot right into the guard's shin. He threw his arms in the air and fell side first off the roof. An arrow then went into my thigh. I cocked my pistol again and rose to my feet. I shot another in the gut. He fired his arrow into the sky and died on the roof. He slid slowly off into the war below. I looked up and saw the only guard that wasn't attacking me was protecting the king with his entire body. This was the soldier with the stone. Another guard came at me with a spear, but I fired directly at his forehead. He fell apart and then died. I advanced slowly at the only two left, the bodyguard and the king. My weapon was high up, aimed at the soldier. "Give it up! You can't win!" I roared. "You! How'd you get out?" the king growled. There was another huge blast, followed by smaller explosions. One was a tank's, others from rocket launchers. The house shook, and hunks of the street rained down on us like a shower. A boulder-shaped rock struck the roof and fell through it until it crashed into the ground level. The king bellowed out with surprise and huddled behind the guard. The guard looked either way around him, trying to pinpoint any more problems. I raised my weapon and laughed happily. It was all so easy. The guard fell to his knees after I left a fresh bullet hole in his armor. He made a faceplant at the feet of the king. The king hissed and leapt at me over the body and over the crater in the roof. I dodged him as he landed neatly next to me. I shot blindly at him, but missed by a long shot. Now I knew I only had one last bullet left in the pistol. I had to save it for the stone. The king clocked me upside my head. I saw stars, and then I fell to my hands and knees. I slipped down the roof. "You stupid mongrel! Look out at the portal!" the king laughed. I looked over towards that way. Out from the shadow world, more soldiers of their kind were charging at the battle. But civilians like the one I had killed inside were following after them, all clad with weapons. Women and children alike were all joining in, doubling their numbers. American soldiers were plowed down into the ground as the soldier people raged across the blood-soaked street. "No chance, huh?" the king laughed again, kicking at my gut. I rolled over and was able to get back up on my feet. I looked the grinning king square in the eye and punched him hard across the mouth. The king's head whipped back, and he collapsed, tangled in his velvet robe. I knelt down next to the dead bodyguard and dug savagely through his bloody armor and belt. The stone was nowhere to be found. Had I killed one of the other soldiers who had the stone? "Looking for this?" the king asked behind me. I turned swiftly around to see the king on his feet. He held the stone between his thin fingers, rolling it around to mock me. In his other hand he held a long, double-edged sword. He spit blood into the fire around him and chuckled into the red sky. He looked back at me with his cold stone eyes and smiled. "You can't stop this, human. This was written in the stars," the king screamed over the heavy machine gun fire. "I've waited all my life for this opportunity, and you won't get in my way." He lifted the sword above his head. I did the same with the pistol, which only had one more bullet. I had to remember what Joe had taught me at the firing range, to focus on your point and imagine yourself hitting the focus point in your mind. "Come on, you're the hero, right? Save the day," he moaned. "Kill me, come on, do it!" I screamed so loud it felt like my lungs expanded and popped. In my mind's eye, I imagined the stone exploding in a spark of light. I saw the king hurling off the roof in a spray of his blood, and I imagined the portal closing in a clean sweep. I pulled the trigger and saw what happened next in slow motion. King laughed as he slashed his fine sword at the bullet with tiger-like reflexes. The bullet struck the sword, and the blade shattered in a shower of metallic blades. The king screamed as the shards of the sword struck him all across his gray face and in his neck. The bullet then hit the target, and just like in my mind, the king's hand twisted around the stone in a squelch of blood. The stone was struck, and it cracked down the middle. Then I was blinded by the explosion of solar bright light. I could still hear the king of the shadow world, howling with pain as he fell backwards off the roof, was obscured by sight from the pluming light. I fell back as well, the gun resting on my side. The battle below me seemed to halt as soldiers from both sides looked up at the magnificent light from the shattered stone. Then the portal to the left of me faded and started to slowly close. Electricity littered the blood-red sky of my world. The shadow creatures, seeing that their world was disappearing, leapt at it. One of them had taken the king's body with him. It closed, and the crowd of army men were either screaming in anger or triumph. I smiled happily as the one last shred of hope shined through the dark clouds. "Men, fall back!" I heard from the Americans below. I looked over the roof edge and saw that, as all the shadow men were distracted, the soldiers were taking off in their vehicles or on their own feet. "Well, take me with you," I tried to yell, but the United States Army was already out of the targeted area. So, at 5:43 p.m., on Bluebird Lane in Derwin, Colorado, the President of the United States broke open the envelope of Plan B. A heavy artillery missile was launched from Washington, D.C., and was already on its way. The shadow creatures looked up in fear at the missile enveloping the sky with its thick white smoke. It curved in the air, and its nose was pointed at George's old neighborhood. They all took off running, trampling over each other in their mad rush. I clutched my journal, that was still in my jeans, and huddled up against the warm shingles. I closed my eyes and waited for heaven's pearly gates. It passed right over my shaking body in a roar that shook the house and temporarily deafened me. Then, without any further notice, the missile struck the street only a few blocks up. There was the hot sting on my face and the feeling of the roof collapsing under me. I fell down into the licking flames, and the force of the explosion rocked me into unconsciousness. The shortest war in U.S. history of 3 days had just ended in a blinding blast heard from 5 states over. God bless America. Now, as the army men rooted through the rubble above the crater I lie in, I tried desperately to finish with my tale, although George's piano is crushing my lower body, and my left arm seems to be currently missing. I can't call out for the men above, because I have no more strength. I'm afraid my time is growing shorter, so I will have to end my story sometime. Hopefully someone will come upon this burnt journal, so people can understand how and why this all happened and how I prevented the real Earth from being joined together once again. So as I lay here in this smoking crater of my own blood, accompanied by bodies of the unholy creatures I had warned Georges about from the very beginning, I still ponder over something. I hope on heaven's blue sky that when God created 3 stones and placed them on my earth, that he didn't also make 3 other stones to place on the shadow earth. We can only hope. Jim Sanders.